Excited you could join us today for Steve Jones's session, Database DevOps to Ensure Compliance. This 24 hours of PaaS consists of 24 consecutive live webinars delivered by expert speakers from the PaaS community. The sessions will be recorded and posted online after the event, and you will receive an email letting you know when the recordings are available. My name is Jan Mulkens. Apart from being an MSBI consultant, I run several user groups, both local and virtual, but you're not here for me, you're here for Steve Jones. I have a few introductory slides before I hand over the reins to Steve. So if you require any technical assistance, please type your questions into the question pane located on the right side of your screen, and someone will assist you. This question pane is also where you may ask any questions throughout the presentation. Feel free to enter your questions at any time, and once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read your questions aloud to the speaker. You are able to zoom in on the presentation content by using the zoom button located on the top of the presentation window. And please note that there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is very important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. This will pop up after the webinar ends in your web browser. So I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsor, Quest. The staging of 24 hours of PaaS would not be possible without their generous support, and they are the reason this event is available free of charge. If you would like to learn more about Quest and sign up for information on how they can help you, please visit the sponsors page of the 24 Hours of PaaS website. PaaS is a global, not-for-profit association where data professionals connect, share, and learn, and joining PaaS is free. It gives you access to hundreds of hours of free online content, live, virtual, and in-person events, and the ability to join local groups in your area, and the opportunity to attend the annual conference, PaaS Summit. PaaS is a great way to connect with like-minded professionals, increase your technical expertise, and grow your career. Steve?
Oh, yeah, it's
you locked up.
There we go. There we are.
Okay. So Steve Jones, with Database DevOps to Ensure Compliance. Yeah. So this 24 Hours of PaaS session is presented by Steve Jones. Steve is a Microsoft SQL Server MVP and has been working with SQL Server since version 4.2 on OS2. After working as a DBA and developer for a variety of companies, Steve co-founded the community website SQLServerCentral.com in 2001. Since 2004, Steve has been the full-time editor of the site, ensuring it continues to be a great resource for SQL Server professionals. Over the last decade, Steve has written hundreds of articles about SQL Server for SQLServerCentral.com, SQL Server Standard Magazine, SQL Server Magazine, and Database Journal. So Steve, take it away, please.
All right, thank you very much, Jan. So welcome everybody to this session. Hopefully you've been having a good day and you've been watching some of the other sessions. I know I've seen a couple and there's some good ones. So just a little bit about myself real quick. You know, I do want to thank Microsoft for recognizing me as an MVP because I'm honored that they choose to do so. I do try to spend some time and effort helping the community out, speaking at different events around the world, but it's nice that they recognize me as well. And I think Microsoft's built an amazing platform, and it's really driven my career for really close to 30 years now. So I've been working with SQL Server since 1991, as Jan mentioned, and I've worked with all the versions, you know, up through the current one, 2017, you know, on Azure, and now I've worked on 3 platforms because I have SQL Server on Linux, SQL Server on Windows, and I used to work SQL Server on OS2 as well. My contact information is listed there. It's at the end as well, but please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or get a hold of me through my blog or on Twitter if you have any other questions. This session is kind of similar to what I'll talk about at the summit, but it's not a lot of overlap here. This session is really a different twist on database DevOps and talking about how we look at compliance with really anything that you have to comply with. So the agenda is kind of to talk a little bit about DevOps and level set, and then talk about just 3 different areas where DevOps helps us a little bit with compliance. And compliance could be with regulations such as In the US, we have HIPAA, we have SOX, we have PCI. Well, PCI is not a regulation, but we have HIPAA and SOX. Overseas, we have GDPR. My company's Redgate Software, and we're in the UK, so GDPR is near and dear to our hearts as well. But it could be with standards. So PCI is a standard; you can be certified there. ISO is a standard. There's various ISO standards that I've been bound different companies that I've worked with as well. Or there could be internal policies. These could be policies that your industry kind of has as a general guideline. They could be policies that your own internal company has, or maybe just the policies that you have set or somebody else has set in your group that wants to be sure that your database development, your database operation proceeds in some fashion that makes sense to you, that works as well. So the idea here is really to look at database DevOps as a way of making compliance easier with whatever type of boundary you have in terms of your work. So regulation, standard, policy, or anything else. So with that in mind, I want to level set just a little bit with DevOps. I do some DevOps talks. Some of you may have had the chance to see me last year at the summit or the year before. I can't remember when I did a database DevOps talk, but I like to level set a little bit just so at least you understand how I think of DevOps. I don't know if I have the correct, proper, or most popular definition, but from my perspective and how I'll talk about it and how I relate to things, I just want to be sure you understand. So I like to reach way back to 2009. At the Velocity conference, there were two gentlemen that gave this kind of seminal talk on DevOps. And the title of their talk was this 10 plus deploys per day, Dev and Ops Cooperation at Flickr. Now, Paul Hammond and John Alspaugh both worked at Flickr, and they were a developer and an operations person that had learned to work together to deliver DevOps solutions. I don't know how many of you would deploy to production 10 times per day today, or even once per day or once per week, but at the time in 2009, the idea of deploying 10 times per day to production was just phenomenal. It really shocked the world. And they talked about the way that they did this was by just working together and providing some standardization in how they moved forward, but in a very lightweight way. So some of you may have been bound by ITIL or COBRA or some of these other standards that we've had across the years in IT organizations that tend to be very heavyweight. And at Flickr, they really tried to make it very lightweight and used automation as much as possible, standardization, and a lot of communication between them. Now, this grew from that point. In 2010, Etsy did a talk of 50 deploys per day. Usually at this point, I typically survey people a little bit and ask them, how often do you deploy, or have you deployed this often? But I also asked them about Amazon. So Amazon is this kind of huge company that has built this incredible cloud infrastructure, both to run their e-commerce business as well as the AWS platform. And last year, they released their numbers for 2016. So at this point, the numbers are 2 years old. But at that point in time, when they looked back at 2016, they added up all their deployments to production and all their developers, and they tried to release some metrics. They actually released a kind of an astounding metric to me. Now, we're not in the same room, so I can't ask you or take your guesses, but if you take a second, just think, how often do you think Amazon deploys per day, or how much time between deployments? In 2016, Amazon's time for a deployment was about 13 seconds, a little less than 13 seconds. So about every 13 seconds, they're doing deployments. Now, of course, they have a huge infrastructure. They're deploying in parallel sometimes to different sides of this from different groups or developers. So, there may be periods of time where nothing is deployed, and then there may be periods of time where lots of stuff is deployed from different groups. But it's all kinds of deployments. Now, they're not all big. Some of them are CSS changes, image changes, that kind of thing. Some might be just typos, but some are database changes. Some are fundamental code changes to infrastructure or code changes to applications. And it's kind of phenomenal that they do this without things going down. I don't want to dismiss Microsoft here, because Microsoft does the same thing. They've actually have a phenomenal way where they deploy things to Azure, and they have this amazing role-based control system where they'll actually make a new build of SQL Server and they'll deploy it to the Azure cloud, and only the internal developers, or maybe only the certain developer that built it, has access. And then over time, they continue to deploy and they refine it, and eventually they roll that out to the rest of us, at some point in time. But it's kind of amazing. And they're doing all this in this moniker of DevOps, which isn't a prescriptive methodology. So it isn't like Agile or Scrum or Lean or Kanban, where we try to tell you how to do things. It's more that there are these principles involved that you're trying to adhere to, and the specific implementation of those principles is whatever it means to you, whatever's appropriate for you. So Gene Kim, who used to be the CTO of Tripwire, he's been in a number of startups and companies along his career, has tried to become really a DevOps advocate. So in addition to some of the corporate work he does, he tries to advocate for and put on conferences about DevOps. And he's distilled it kind of down to these 3 principles. Now, you may find some people have 4 principles or a couple of other ideas, but I really like these 3 principles as a way of thinking of things. They're systems thinking, amplifying feedback loops, and then having a culture of experimentation and learning. Now, systems thinking, something I've always done in my career, but it's something I found many times people don't do that are in technology. Systems thinking is thinking holistically of our entire system, not my application, my database, my network stack, my machines. It's the whole process of software development. So I want to think about architects and project managers and business analysts, and then I think about developers, and I think about testers and QA, and I think about release people and operations individuals and DBAs and customer support and help desk people. Think about the entire system of our software application, whatever it is, and how quickly can I get work through that system. So when a client files a bug, or they suggest an idea, or they come up with a feature, and that goes to perhaps an architect or perhaps a developer or a project manager, somebody, they put that together, it gets built, it gets tested. We may go through that process a few times. Eventually we deploy it to test systems, maybe to staging or pre-production systems, and eventually get to production, and then the client can see it. What's that entire process? And the goal here is that I don't want to optimize my job as a developer, or my job as a DBA, or my job as a help desk person. I want to optimize the entire system so that I flow work through as smoothly and as quickly as possible. And it doesn't mean that we have to go fast, but it means that we want to go at our pace. While we do that, we also want to amplify feedback loops. So we're familiar with the idea of feedback. I send something to operations, and then DBA tells me it doesn't work well, or the customer tells me it's wrong in some way, or it doesn't work correctly, or whatever it is. But we want to not only amplify those feedback loops where I understand the implications of what I've done, but I want to amplify feedback loops the other way, so that when I know that there are things that would make the process easier, I let somebody upstream of me know. So I let the developer know what makes my job as a DBA easier, or let the tester know what kinds of things they should look at that I see on the help desk. It's feedback in both ways. And then I amplify those loops so that over time, I get lower and lower values of feedback. So typically it's somebody's upset and they make a phone call or file a ticket, but we want to get down to starting to get information from our instrumentation, from monitoring and metrics, so that we understand things before customers are aware. And then as much as we want to use our experience and our knowledge and our skill to build software and rely on those skills, we want to experiment and learn and find new ways of doing things. We want to try different ways to see if we can be a little bit better. We typically want to make small experiments. So that's kind of the fail fast methodology. But failing fast is also failing small. So I want to make small changes and understand, could I make these database changes quicker? Could I build software in a way that's works a little bit better? Can I add instrumentation to it? Can I find out more about how features are being used? Can I learn how to do toggling or feature flags, those kinds of things? And then I want to share that learning, but not just with myself and changing my habits, but share it with others. And those are kind of the principles that drive DevOps. Now, there's nothing in there that says what types of technology we use or how we structure our teams or anything else. They're just general principles. And database DevOps is kind of just applying these to our data store, whatever that is. Is that Oracle, SQL Server? Is it a MongoDB? Is it a Neo4j? Whatever it is, I want to apply those principles there. Now, I saw this definition from Donovan Brown, who is he's one of the DevOps evangelists at Microsoft. Actually, I'm not sure what Donovan does anymore, but I had the honor of presenting with him a few years ago at Build, and he's quite a dynamic individual. And he came with this definition on his blog that DevOps is this union of people, processes, and products to enable continuous delivery value to end users. I've talked to some customers and clients over the years about this, and some of them said, well, we all know this is our job, right? We have to deliver value to our end users. And I agree with that, but you're missing out a little bit if you just take this statement at face value. mean, DevOps is this union, so it's not this particular technology. It's not this process that we have in place, but it's a combination of one or many processes and whoever is involved. So you can see here I have a number of people here, architect, developer, etc., listed, where we all tend to become silos in some way, and we're not unioning together, which is really what DevOps is about. And then we don't want to worry about what technology is. So whatever platform, whatever tools, whatever software, whatever technology you want to use, as long as we can continuously deliver value to our end users, that's what's important. And the continuous part is important. So I want to be able to release on whatever schedule is appropriate for my application. If I need to make changes every day, I should be able to do that without a problem. If it's once a week is sufficient, that's great. If once a year is fine for major value, that's okay, but I should be able to continuously enhance that. So I actually have a customer that builds HR type software. So legally, they typically change things once a year. But along with that delivery once a year for legal obligations, there are little tweaks and changes and enhancements and bugs that need to be fixed continuously throughout the year. And so as they try to move to more of a DevOps process, they have the ability to not only make that major release to comply with legal obligations, but they have the ability then to continue to enhance and refine their changes in response to customer work. And that's really what we're aiming to do. And ultimately, rather than these silos, what we really want to do is have communication, collaboration, and some integration between groups. So on the development side, I certainly have architects and I have business analysts, and I guess customers still fall over as well, but certainly developers and QA, all these groups that exist on the development side. I want them to work closely with people on the operational side, so release engineers, sysadmins, and help desk, and customers again on that side, so that we all work a little bit closer together to understand how things work. So with that in mind, what I want to do is do a little bit of a demo and show you some things working through here as soon as I find Management Studio. Now, what I'm doing isn't terribly important. I'm just going to do a couple things. So I'm going to create a table here. There's nothing magic about this. I'm going to update some data here. So if you look at this data, we have this value of UK as a country code, which is actually incorrect. It should be GB. I'm going to create a view here. There's nothing special there. And I'm going to alter a stored procedure. So I'm actually, in this case, I'm adding a column to this stored procedure. Again, what I'm doing isn't terribly important. It's just a question of actually just being able to make some changes. And then what I want to do is I want to have a consistent process, and I want to move these things forward into other environments. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to capture these changes and put them in version control. And again, the method I'm using isn't really important because there's multiple ways I could do this. But ultimately, what I want to do is look at this and say, well, here are all the changes that I'm making. So I'm adding, or I'm changing the UK around to be the correct code, and I'm changing some other code here as well. And then I'm going to commit those things. So let me commit those things. And then while they're committing, I just want to show you, I've got this other database here, this production database. And I'll show you the other ones. I jumped around without showing you. You'll notice when I execute this in my production database that what I'm going to get is that some of my objects aren't found. Of course, Management Studio decided not to work today. And that some of my objects, like my UK, is incorrect, and I've only got one column in this result set here. So I've got some changes that I actually want to deploy out to my production environment. Over here in my development environment, I've already made those changes. And if I pop back over to my development system, what we'll see is that that's a different database. I happen to have all these on the same instance just because the demo is a little bit smoother and more convenient, but you can imagine that these would all be on different instances, different physical machines and different virtual hosts, and it could potentially even be out in the cloud or somewhere else. So boy, my push doesn't want to work. I assume everybody can still hear me. My connection is good. But in any case, here's my changes. Right? I was in this development database, and I'm going to push these forward. And so what I really want to do, though, is I want to use kind of a DevOps process to do this. So I want to follow through a flow. And a lot of the database DevOps work I do tries to mimic what we see application developers do, what they'll do in C# or what they'll do in Python or Java or any other language that they're using, is to try to build a smooth system that pushes code from one environment to the next. You'll notice here I just have a pull request note that I updated a branch of code and I want to merge that stuff together. So let's create a pull request and we'll do that. Now, application developers are really good at this, that they know how to put code together and commit it into a central repository so everybody can see it. And then they'll actually go ahead and get code reviews, which is something which I see plenty of DBAs forgetting to do because we don't often have a big team of people to do that. So we'll create a pull request, and you can see that my changes are just kind of listed down here so that if I want to go through and deal with them, I can. Of course, wow, the STS is running slow today. Usually this goes quicker. But a pull request is nothing more than, hey, let's actually let somebody know that I've made changes and I'd like them to review them. And so I have the ability to then review those changes. Now, in this pull request, I've got a team over here on the side. That's my demo team that can review my changes. In this case, I can make changes and say these look fine. Comment there. I can go ahead and approve the changes as well, which just kind of logs that, hey, I said this is good and it's welcome to move forward. And then I can complete the change, which will actually merge code between two sections of my repository. So it just puts those changes from my demo branch and it moves them over to my active branch, my master branch. And if I were to look at my master branch, what I'll actually see is that I've got changes in my folders that will have that comment on it. If I come down here, a bunch of changes, and because my code is stored in these subfolders, they're all there. If I were to go through here and look, what I would find is that that table that I just created is right here, and the code is just SQL code. Again, there's nothing magic about this. I'm just trying to have a process that moves my code around. Now, at the same time that that's going on, what I did was I queued up that, or sorry, when I merged those changes, is I actually should have queued up a build, which should be running now. And I think it's just a slow refresh of my page. But the build is just another part of my process. So there's an automated system that says, hey, when you've made changes, let's go ahead and verify that your changes aren't going to cause any fundamental issues. And so we can see here that I've got a build up and queued up, and apparently it's not running. And we'll see if it kicks off here in a moment. I think my connectivity is a little bit slow over here. So hopefully everybody can hear the audio and it's working fine. But in any case, what this build will actually do, and let me, I'm going to kick over to the edit side of things just so we can look at this, is that the build has a series of steps that just allow me to validate software. So in a C# application, we would do a compilation. We would ensure that all of the various modules and namespaces and things are included. All the dependencies are there. We would compile all that code. We would then run any of our unit tests or functional tests that we may have set out there. And then we would, probably produce some artifact, or we'd let the developers know that we have some problem. And so in this case, you can see I've got a build, a test, a sync, and a publish, where I'm just running through various steps that allow me to kind of check my code. And so every time that I make changes, this same process goes. And so let's come back and hopefully this is running. Otherwise, the demo is slightly faulty, but we'll continue on if it's not working in any case. But once I build this allows me to say, hey, we validated some level of my software. And then the next step would be that I would, in fact, try to find ways to release this to different systems. Now, if you're like me, throughout most of my career, I've had to manually release code from one system to the next, which means that I get a script and I have to look at it and I have to make sure that I open it up, connect to the right instance and connect to the right database and I execute it. I've got the right permissions, I do it in the right order. All these things that aren't terribly difficult. But for us as humans to do that repeatedly over and over and over again in a reliable fashion, it can be a little bit challenging. We tend to make mistakes. So just like I would want to have the same process followed for my build every time I change code, I want to have the same process handled with all my releases. So as I move code from one environment to the next, it's always there. So we can see here the build is run and it's actually almost done, which is fantastic. And if I were to look through here at any point in time, I could see that I've got a log of all the information, all the things that I'm doing here. So I have some instrumentation into my process. And certainly I assemble this process over time so that it works in my particular environment. But then once it's done, it's repeatable. And then I move to my release phase. So I've got releases here that tell me here's how I'm going to build all of my systems. And if I want to create a release, let's do that, because I'm hoping that that build is actually complete, and it is. And we can see here that we have a QA, a staging, a production, and actually an Azure system as well. So let me kick this off, let it run, and then I'll talk to you just about what is going on. So I've actually created a new release here, which allows me to say that, hey, this code that was built in your build process, let's go ahead and release this to other environments. So here I have this release. And what I'm doing is right now it should be running. It should have kicked off automatically for QA, which is what we see. I'm going to kick this off to staging. And I'm going to actually kick it off to production as well, because just in the interest of time, we don't want to watch a lot of this stuff run. You can see VSTS is a little slow to redraw here. Let's just kick that off too. And we'll see 2 messages then. There we go. So I'm going to refresh this page because it doesn't want to redraw quickly. Right now what it's doing is I determine how I want to release code. So I know that I need to pick up my SQL code. I need to generate some sort of script that I'm going to use that will work correctly. I need to make sure that I've got credentials to connect this environment. I'm going to deploy that script in the same way for every environment that we've got. And so in this case, I'm going to say I'm going to approve all of these. I'm going to approve all of those and let that run. And so as this runs, I'm actually practicing my deployments. So one of the great things with DevOps is that things that are difficult or things that I need to do reliably, I want to have them, A, operate in a consistent manner, but B, I want to practice them over and over and over again. And so by having a consistent process in the DevOps world, I'm assured that I actually know how to release the software to every database, or I know how that I'm going to release the software to the App Store at Apple or the App Store in Google Play. There's a lot of steps involved in these, but by having a process built that I've gone through and I've tested and validated, I have confidence that I can release whenever I need to. So in this case, we can see it's actually going to deploy this stuff out to my various environments. It's in QA, and hopefully it'll be in production in a second. And once these changes are actually deployed out, what I should see is that those changes that I made here in this development environment, let's execute a new query here. And I'm going to take this entire script over here. This script works perfectly in development, right? Assuming I had done some validation of this table and my data here and my store procedure and my view, I've got everything in place. That should be working in my production environment as well. Now, when I ran this before, I got an error, but now I still get an error. And as soon as this is released, it'll actually work, I hope. It's deploying slightly out of order here just because I think I clicking around quickly just to make this work. So let's now run this query. I think that it's just mistaken what's there, but we'll come back to this. In any case, not in the interest of time, let's just let this run. I think that these two actually updated incorrectly. We'll let this complete and then we'll come back to it. So while we're there, let's pop back over to our slides. Now, in that DevOps process, I'm trying to build a smooth way to develop software. Right? I want to get my changes in the database world in line with the application or applications, and then deployed out to the production environment in a timely fashion. And certainly any other environments that I need to hit, like training or disaster recovery, something else, I do the exact same thing. So I always want to be sure that I have everything moved. But while I'm doing that, kind of as a side effect, I need to ensure that I'm compliant with something, some sort of regulation, some sort of policy, some sort of standard. And DevOps really helps me in a way that I haven't seen in the past when I've worked in non-DevOps type shops. Now, I've been doing some of the software development that I just showed you in DevOps for decades. Before VSTS existed, before TFS was around, I've actually done this with Visual Source Safe, where we just had processes that were smooth and lightweight and consistent to allow us to deploy code in a consistent manner, in a repeatable, reliable manner. And so DevOps isn't anything new. We've kind of just given it a name in the last 5 or 6 years. And then we have different ideas, different models from companies. So some of the things that help me with the DevOps world to ensure compliance is that I want to be sure that all the specifications that I'm using to build software are kind of captured, and I'm getting all that work done. Now, some of you may have worked where you got a huge Word document, and probably even a printed Word document that was pages and pages long. Some of you may have a ticketing system of some sort. Some of you may use something like a Kanban board to make things happen. And all of those are valid ways of checking on your specifications. But let's see how I'm doing that here. Now, in part of VSTS, they have a Kanban board built in, a workflow item. I've done this certainly with multiple applications hooked together or some other chain. But in the compliance, I want to be sure that I'm meeting all the different specifications requirements that my customers have or that my regulations might require. So in this case, you can see that I've got various items in here that let me check things. So for example, I've got this payment processing item that I can easily say, hey, somebody says, by the way, while you're doing this work, we need to get other work done as well because, we need a payment processor on the other side. So, set up, let's say Wells Fargo payment processing. And certainly there may be other details or things along the line that we want to capture. But by tracking this work and having it here, not only is it easy for me as a developer to kind of keep track of things, it's wonderful for me as an architect, so I can see things that might be coming down that people are worried about. As an ops person, I can see what's happening and what's coming through. So I've got different items. For example, I had this bug that appeared. It said the UK code is incorrect. Well, at some point in time, I need to make sure that work is fixed, that something is tracked there. I've got this calculations for articles that was incorrect. This is one of those nice things for me from compliance reasons that I can see and show that we've tried to fix this so that we know what's going on, because it certainly could not just be a customer or a manager that's upset about this bug. It could actually be a financial impact to our company. Things like the GDPR could potentially result in a fine, which could be high or could be low. Right? There's some discretion from regulatory authorities on these. Well, one of the items in the GDPR that we're focusing on at Redgate is that if we're showing progress and that we've got something in place, the fines tend to be much lower, that the authorities understand that we are making headway. We're not perfect and we don't have everything broken now, fixed right now, but anything that's broken, we're working on. So we can see here that I've got this bug that says, hey, you had this item that said go through here and build this feature, right? Which of course wasn't spec'd out very well. There's no description. It said publish more than 4 articles. Well, more than 4 to some people means 5 or more. Some people means 4 or more. Well, in this case, we say the bug that, hey, it's really 4 or more, not more than 4. So we've got this issue. And so there's this work that we have to do to do that. And so as part of that, there was this item, I think, in there. It was assigned to me, and I did some of that work. And so I can track back who did the work or what's there. And I think I need to refresh this because it should be showing that I actually logged the bug against this particular item. I think I did, because that was one of the items in my comment, wasn't it? Well, let's run this and see. Of course, I broke something there, but did I have 150? I didn't have 150 there. Should have had 150. But in any case, as I do work, I have the ability to backtrack and understand what work I've done and where that's related back to the actual item that I was building on. So having this instrumentation allows me to kind of prove that I'm doing the proper work that was requested and that I've completed it or not. Now, the second item is an interesting one, and this is actually, I'll talk about more about this at the summit. That's kind of what my session is a little bit about, is worrying about my attack surface area and development test areas. One of the things I've often done in many environments is we restore production to QA, or we restore production to development, because we want all that data just makes our life easier. We understand what the problem is. We can look at a data field or a row of data and compare that to what somebody says works or doesn't work in production or how they want it changed. And so it's very convenient for developers. However, we so rarely secure our development environments in the same way as our production environment. So we try to avoid PII data. More and more I find that this is one of those areas where our customers and clients are trying to move any sensitive information out of development and test because it's just a risk issue. If we lose that data from development test, it's way worse than we're losing it from production. And to be fair, there's been quite a few attacks against test and development environments that have been successful with their PII data. And so in this case, let me flip over, and I've got this other development database because I don't want to mess up that one I have or change anything in this demo because apparently I've broken something. But in this case, you can see I've got a series of names here in this area, which are actually different than what I have in production. So if I come over to production, I've got these different names here, right? I've got Mr. Davidson and Mr. Mechanic and others, and I've got phone numbers and addresses, which aren't real. I couldn't use real information in this demo, but potentially those would be sensitive information, right? Email addresses, all of this stuff would be sensitive data in a production environment. What I want to make sure is when I get to a development environment that it's consistent data that I can use. It has some shape and some skew and scale that makes sense for my application, but it's not the production data. And so if I were to do something here like let's update contacts and let's set full name equal to Steve. And of course I should do where contact equal 1, but being a developer in a hurry, I'm sure none of you have ever done this before. I think that's actually contact full name is what it is. Executed data like this. I hate to say it, but I've done this in production environments as well as others, which is why I try not to do ad hoc work. But in this case, I've messed up my environment. Well, one of the ways I want to do is I want to be able to, provision my environment really quick. So I've got this process here. Sorry, I can't type and do it at the same time, where I can re-provision the development environment in a consistent manner really quickly, but in a way that's consistent enough for me so that if a developer is working long and they need another copy or we hire somebody else, that we always get the same information back. In this case, I'll need to connect again, which is fine. And I've got my data back here. And the speed and everything isn't important because I've certainly used backup and restore to do this. We've used virtual machine templating to build this back, but I want to have a consistent process in my development area that allows me to deploy environments in a way that makes sense to me so that I'm compliant with whatever standards I want. If I want to curate a data set, I can do that. If I want to get rid of all PII data and keep all the other real data, that's fine. Whatever it is, I'm using a DevOps process to make this repeatable and reliable. It allows me to repeat it. And then I want to prove that I've followed some process and I show the process. And so I've done a little bit of this before that in my CI process, we know that we have this consistent process that runs over and over and over again. And if I look at my summary here, what I see is that I've followed this process over and over and over again. So each time it happens, I have a record of what's going on. In my code area, I can see the history of all the code changes. I can see who approved those pull requests, who made those changes. So we always kind of know that we are following the process. One of the things that I learned in ISO certification is that what process we have was not nearly as important as having some sort of documentation that shows what our process is, and then showing that we are following that process over and over again. By having this instrumentation and logging, I can see all the things that I've been doing and that they're proceeding in a consistent manner. It doesn't mean that all of these success, because you can see down here I've had a failure. It means that I'm just aware that the process is ongoing. And the same thing happens in my releases. If I look at my history of my releases, that's not what I wanted. I want to view my releases. What I see is that I can tell each time that I have made a deployment somewhere, have I followed the process? You can see here it failed. You can see sometimes I don't deploy to every environment. It's important that I'm just documenting the process and showing that I'm moving forward in that consistent manner. One of the other things that's important for me, at least this is something that I find very important, is testing. It's testing my software to ensure that it works as it should work. And should certainly is defined by clients or somebody that's in charge of architecting the software. But I want some way to prove that I'm actually testing things. Seeing no shortage of errors in production environments because somebody didn't test something. And I've certainly seen some of these errors live for years in production environments because nobody really bothered to closely scrutinize and check it. Somebody made a specification, developer wrote software, it deployed and it appeared to work, and they've left it alone. And I've seen it cost money to customers, or sorry, not customers, the vendors that run software, right? So a customer of mine, but somebody that might run the software like an Amazon or a Target or a Walmart, and their customers are actually using software that doesn't work correctly. So I've seen this within areas of discounts, in the areas of billing, in the areas wherever money changes hands, that the software doesn't work correctly. And so what happens is the company that runs the software ends up losing money, and they don't realize until years later that they could have been much more profitable. In the DevOps world, because we are including testing as a part of what we do, we're ensuring that we can make changes quickly if we find issues. We don't push those back and delay them. We tend to be more profitable because we have the ability to make these changes. And so some of the things we want is we want consistent environments and consistent data sets that we set up. So that means everything from the configuration of the machine, the collations of the servers, the types of data sets that we need to use for testing and for development, so we know where we check for nulls and we look for empty strings and negatives and dates far in the future and past, and those kinds of things, so that we're ensure that our software handles all those edge cases. And then we ensure that it meets all the specifications and it does the actual testing that we need done. And so some of that I've done, standards and code analysis fall in as well. If I look back at my code, actually, let me show you this. One of the things I'm doing is I'm including tests in my system. And so I've got this test article payment summary by month where I'm actually running a test to say, if I run this stored procedure, do I get this data back? And one of the things that I want to be sure is that I'm actually doing this and running this test. We find in software, developers are usually pretty good about running their unit tests, but they do forget. Even though they're built into Eclipse and Visual Studio and PyCharm and all these IDEs, people forget. So we want automated methods of testing that some system can always run. So we can see here I've got this test. I've actually got a history if I wanted to look at the different ones in my initial test and my new test have different values because we realized that it was 4 or 5 was the issue. When I go back and look at my last build, what I can see is that my test actually ran. And so that test should have passed before I went forward. Now, all my tests actually passed, but you can see that I have a number of tests in this system that are actually running all the time. And in this case, by default, I only show failed tests, but let's go ahead and show past tests here. And then we'll see is all those tests are there. And so we're testing that payment summary by month. And I have the results that I can dig in here. I'm also doing additional testing. So I'm doing kind of standards-based testing for certain things. For example, like store procedures not using SP underscore. That's one of those areas that is a code smell. It can cause issues over time. Using set row count is not recommended any longer. We don't want to do that. Tables without a primary key. That's one of those code analysis things as well that I can test. So if a table doesn't have a primary key, if a developer's forgotten, we fail the test and we stop the build, and then they know then to go add a primary key, or they know to talk with the DBA and the architect and to decide that this table really doesn't need a primary key, in which case we'd make an exception for this test. But the goal here is to try to ensure that I'm using testing in my DevOps world to make myself compliant with both regulations and policies as well as best practices. And the last thing I want to talk about is security here. Now, security is always an important part of our work. It's becoming more and more important in the world as data really becomes more important. And so we need to not so much control access, but we want to make sure that we have the principle of least access. So people have access to the data they need and no more, or to make the changes that they want to do or not. And in the US especially, we want separation of duties. And so we have the ability to do that. So as I provision environments out, let me pop over here to my Object Explorer. One of the things I say in my development environment, I've got all these things. I've got this role, web users, which is in use. And so I've decided role-based security is a great idea. I don't have any members in this role because as I've moved this role or moved this database, if I've ever stored it in production, I make sure I clean up those things. While I'm cleaning up all this PII data, I also make sure that I clean up things like security because developers shouldn't have access to production. So I want to be careful of that. However, in my production system, I have the same role, but I have users in here, right? My application user, I have some production users as well. Those are there. Those are kept separate. And in fact, by using role-based security, I can show that I've got a separation, or I've got the ability to control the access and use the principle of least permissions or least access there by setting users in production and development different and controlling and making sure that as I apply security, it flows through. But I also have security inside of my system. So inside of my my build system and my release system, I have the ability to set security as well. So I have different teams and groups here, and you can see that this system allows me to say that people that are build administrators can do certain things. So I can set somebody that has the ability to run builds but not change the build, or I can set somebody that has the ability to release software but they can't change things. Because one of the things that's very important to me is that there are certain people that are privileged that have the ability to access systems and change the way our software process works. And there's others that need to use that process. And so I want to separate those out. Certainly could be overlapped. The DBA often can do both, but I want to be careful and show that everything is, I know exactly what's happening. The other thing is, as I build these releases, and where's my list of releases? I can see the history, this is the one I want, of that release or what's going on. So I can look and see who actually approved it. Now in this demo system, of course, I'm doing the work and VSTS does some work as well, but this would be similar in TFS. You can imagine that somebody has queued deployment and then somebody has triggered it and somebody has approved it. And as you can see, here's my comment. And so if I'm trying to understand who has released the change or why something works or doesn't work, or perhaps who has updated the software in a way that runs us afoul of some regulation or standard, we can determine what happened. Now, it's not so much to blame, but it's a learning experience. So we might go, perhaps we had a problem in the past, maybe we need less people that can approve something, maybe we need another step in our process to ensure something is reviewed, additional testing, something else. But I can configure the system to work however I want to work. The important thing is that I'm somehow setting things in place that I can manage in a consistent, reliable, repeatable fashion, and use that to lower the risk of things going wrong, and also demonstrating that I'm showing compliance. Now, at the summit this year, I'll talk on kind of an expansion of just the dev and test environment and actually worrying about the data that you use in those environments and trying to ensure that it's useful and valuable for development, but it's not a risk issue or it's not increasing my attack surface area. So if you'd like to learn about that, I have no idea what day I'll be speaking, but the session will be on the schedule somewhere there as well. And so with that, I'm going to end it. John, are there any questions?
Well, turns out you bamboozled the audience. Nobody dared to ask a question, probably because it was all clear.
That's always good.
Yeah.
Hopefully that means I did my job and not that everybody fell asleep and left or anything else.
They're still there.
All right, good. Well, thank you for attending and hopefully enjoyed it. And again, you can reach out to me on Twitter or through my blog if you'd like to hold me.